This episode is sponsored by Prodigy Math. Test prep season? Bring it on. With Prodigy's free, game-based platform, students in grades 1 through 8 get fun, focused math practice, and you get a data-driven teacher tool to supercharge your review game. Learn more at prodigy.com. The National Council of Teachers of Mathematics welcomes you to Adding It All Up, a podcast created by and for mathematics educators and teachers. Join us each month as we explore current topics, insights, and emerging trends with thought leaders in the math community. And now, the hosts of Adding It All Up, NCTM President Latrenda Knighten and NCTM Past President Kevin Dykema.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Adding It All Up. I'm Kevin Dykema, current past president for NCTM. And as always, I'm joined by my fabulous co-host, Latrenda Knighten, who is the current president of NCTM. Latrenda and I have been talking quite a bit lately about the integration of math and literacy. And we know it's everywhere. It's amazing how much literacy naturally shows up in our math lessons.
So true, Kevin. Whether it's interpreting word problems, writing about math strategies, or just engaging in math discussions, literacy plays such a huge role. And when students explain their reasoning or use precise math language, they're strengthening both their math skills and their communication skills.
I think before we dive into our guest conversation today, Latrenda and I, why don't we each share a little bit of our own experiences? So I'll start with you, Latrenda. How have you seen math and literacy come together when you were a classroom teacher? Can you share any examples of a time when this integration really benefited your students?
Thanks, Kevin. I can think of one almost perfect example. It was when I returned to the classroom to teach little kids after in the past I taught older kids, like fourth and fifth graders. And so one of the things I had to do was teach every content area, which was okay, except I had to teach writing as well. And teaching writing to first graders was a little bit scary for me. And so one of the things that I found is that if my students wrote about math, which they love math, that it helped them and me to learn how to teach them to be good writers. But at the same time, it really strengthened their math skills because it made them think about the language that we use to communicate mathematics, just that everyday language. So it really helped increase their vocabulary. It helped with precise math language. And it gave me a unique way to actually integrate writing into my classroom. So it benefited my kids and me, to be completely honest. What about you, Kevin?
I love that you said you taught older kids, and you said, with fourth and fifth graders, because as an eighth grade teacher, I don't think of fourth and fifth grader as older kids. So it's always so fun talking with you and hearing your elementary perspective on things. I think one of the areas in my own classroom that I really try to integrate math and literacy is having my students engage in discussions. And when I learn to be quiet and not drive the classroom, let my students sort of do the driving, it's always amazing to me the rich conversations they have and the different ideas that they bring forth that we can then build on. And not surprisingly, my eighth graders don't always think the same way that I think. They see different ways of doing the problems. I tend to jump straight to trying to come up with an equation or a formula or something, and they just don't. They just reason through it, and they have so much more sophisticated ways than some of mine. But I've learned that when I do have that ability to keep myself quiet long enough to actually listen to them and to allow them to have those conversations, I just get such a great peek into their thinking, which is such a powerful thing in the math classroom.
Thanks for sharing that, Kevin. Yeah, I forget older kids for me and older kids for you sometimes might be a little bit different. So now let's loop into our guest speakers who are going to offer even more strategies and ideas to help strengthen the connection between math and literacy. Please welcome Susie, Katt, and Dave Ebert. Susie, Dave, would you like to introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Hi, I'm Susie Katt, and I'm the K-2 math coordinator in Lincoln Public Schools in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I am really honored to be the chairman for the joint NCTE-NCTM conference this June.
Hello, my name is Dave Ebert. I'm a high school math teacher at Oregon High School, which is just in southern Wisconsin. And honored to be a part of this. I previously served on the board of directors at NCTM with Kevin, and I've done some work with Latrenda as well. So honored that you guys would include me in this conversation. Thank you.
We're thrilled to have both of you with us today. So Dave, we'll start with you, and then Susie, feel free to chime in as well. How do you naturally integrate literacy into your math instruction? Do you have any examples of a lesson or activity where they work together effectively?
Good question to lead us off, Kevin. I think the key word in that question is that word naturally. And I'm going to tell a story that describes why I think that's a key word. Once upon a time earlier in my teaching career, I tried to get my students to read some different books with different mathematical connections. I teach statistics, and one book I had them read was the book How to Lie with Statistics. It was big quite a number of years ago, perhaps in the 60s. And I tell you what, it didn't go over so well. And I couldn't figure out why my students were not engaging in this book. So then a couple of years after that, I noticed all my students were reading the book The Fault in Our Stars by John Green. And you might have read this book in the past, or you might have had students that have read this book. And I swear half my students were reading this book all at the same time. So I always want to know what they're reading. So I read it as well. And there's a point in that book where the main character states, some infinities are bigger than other infinities. And that got me thinking. It took me back to my college mathematics classes, started thinking about Georg Cantor, who proved that there's a hierarchy of infinities. And then I brought this idea into my class and introduced this to my students. And they're really excited by this, that here, this book that they're all reading was connected to some really high level, deeper mathematics. And so back to that key word you used, that word naturally, I learned that the key for me was, instead of me bringing my mathematical literature to my students, what I need to do is bring my students' literature into the mathematics classroom. And it just allowed us all to make that really strong connection between this higher level math idea and the literature that they were all reading at that time.
Very similarly, Dave, it's interesting. You teach high school, I work with elementary students, and we can integrate books or literature into the mathematics classroom. And in an elementary classroom, using a book is really a great springboard to a math lesson. It's really a familiar way a lot of teachers use that. It's a way to get students excited about what's coming up and the content. It doesn't have to be the whole story. You can just give bits and pieces. And one I recently used with some first graders and fourth graders, and it was successful in both contexts, was a book called One Chicken Nugget. And what was really interesting, and if you've heard the book, the folktale, The One Grain of Rice, it has something very similar to do of that. But this was a story about Frank, and Frank is a really lovable monster who loves chicken nuggets. Long story short, he went to a food truck and was obviously scaring the customers away, which irritated the owner. And so she created an eating contest and hoped to get rid of him, and basically said, hey, if you win, you're going to get free chicken nuggets for life. But if you don't, you have to leave and never come back to my food truck. Well, so what happens is the contestants start eating one chicken nugget and then two, and then they double that, and then they double that. And you can probably anticipate what happens. And I'm going to tell you a little surprise. There's a big burp at the end, which obviously the kids love, right? And so what was really interesting is those conversations just naturally happened. They just started talking about, like, what if I had $1 and I doubled it, and then I doubled it? And they were talking and using their things in their own world. And I love when the little girl goes, I have two squishies. What if I doubled that and then doubled again? And so they were using things in their real life to use and think about multiplicative ideas. And it was just really cool. So I think that's really an easy way to pull in that literature, and it brings a context for students to start to think about those mathematical ideas.
Thank you. You guys both gave some wonderful examples to help our listeners when they begin to think about integrating math and literacy, and definitely thinking about natural connections. So, how do you incorporate reading strategies such as close reading or the three read strategy into your math instruction so that you can help students interpret and analyze word problems?
That's a great question. And often I work with lower elementary, but all elementary students. And a very typical response to a word problem for a young student is that they just grab the numbers and go, right? We call that number grabber. I actually like to call it the drive-through strategy. They grab the numbers just as someone grabs their food through a drive-through, and then they just drive off. And then the student grabs those numbers and they just start to compute. And usually it's what's been happening in the classroom. So if they're adding, they'll just start adding. Or if they've been subtracting, they'll start subtracting. They don't even really read the problem. And so we've got to help students not focus on just producing an answer, but really rather understanding that mathematical situation. So as teachers, I think we have to have some intentional moves to help them pump the brakes a little bit, to slow it down, to read the problem. I actually was working with a first grade student recently, and I got 3 words into the story problem, and he started writing down numbers, and he didn't even know what the story was about. So really helping them say, like, oh gosh, if you take time to understand the story and think about the context of the situation and then really gather information, what they need to be able to solve that problem, it's going to help them. And so that's why utilizing a strategy like close reading, it really encourages students to do this, right? Or the 3 reads. Every time they read, they're going to slow down, they're going to think about something else, a little bit more information, or what the quantities are in the problem. And so those strategies really help students squeeze some of those details from the story, and then it helps them gain a deeper understanding of the mathematical situation. And then they can start to develop a plan of how they might solve that problem. And they're likely going to engage in much more sense making and be more successful rather than just grabbing the numbers and starting to compute. Dave, what might that look like in high school?
One of the big things you mentioned there was mathematical understanding. And it's interesting how throughout K-12, this idea of mathematical understanding is consistent. It's not just an elementary thing, not just a high school thing. It's pervasive at every level. And one thing we do a lot at the high school level, it's kind of surprising to a lot of people, but we actually use the 3-read strategy quite a bit at the high school level. So as part of the 3-read strategy, for the first couple reads, we don't reveal the final prompt. So we don't tell the students what they're actually looking for. So on the first read through, and the first read, we'll model this as a whole class. Sometimes I'll read it, but ideally a student reads this. But we read the entire problem as an entire class. And then we're really looking for what is the situation about? Are there any vocabulary words we don't understand? And a lot of times it's not mathematical vocabulary, it's just vocabulary in the context of the problem. What does the problem even mean? So the first read is as a whole class without the final prompt, but just to kind of figure out what's the situation about. Then the second read we do, and a lot of times we'll have students do this individually, but ideally I like to see this done with teams, with a partner or a team of 4 students. And for the second read, the students are looking at what quantities can be measured. And when we look at what quantities can be measured, we try to be as specific as we can. Not just say we can measure distance, but how can we measure distance? And distance can be measured in what units. So real specifically, what quantities. Then the third read, here's where the final prompt comes in, where we look at, okay, what are we actually looking to solve here in this problem? So we read this again with that prompt. And at that point, we're answering the question, what are potential solution strategies? And by this point, kids have read this 3 times, they're ready. Kind of like Susie, you were saying, your younger students, they want to jump in and solve right away. And that's why we take that prompt away. So if the prompt is missing, they can't jump in and solve. And by the third read through, usually they are ready. They've got an idea what this problem is looking at. They know some things that can be measured. And then when they see that question, what they're looking for, they're ready to jump in. And by slowing down like this, by reading through it 3 times, there's so many times in high school that I assume students know some vocabulary and they don't. Or maybe they even assume they know it too, but really they've got a misunderstanding of what it is. So by slowing down, it gives them a model of how they can understand any word problem. Since they've seen this modeled as a whole class so often, when they're on their own looking at a word problem, they have this strategy in their minds. So they know first read through, they're not expected to be able to jump in and get the answer right away, that they can take a step back, read it again, and then read it a third time as well before jumping in. And I really think it helps build that mathematical understanding for our students.
This episode is sponsored by Prodigy Math. Wish you had a magic wand for spotting skill gaps during test prep season? We've got you. Prodigy is an adaptive, game-based learning platform designed to help you track student progress and create targeted assignments and quizzes, all for free. Learn more at prodigy.com.
I'm really appreciating this focus on the student understanding and putting some strategies in place to slow our students down, whether it's at the high school level, whether it's at the elementary level where they become just those number grabbers or the drive-through with the numbers. But let's shift our conversation a little bit. So we started talking about children's books or adult type of books with the high school. And then we talked about some reading strategies. Let's talk about writing, because we know writing is another component of literacy. So what role do you see writing play in helping students develop good mathematical reasoning and problem-solving skills?
So way back in the year 2000, NCTM came up with their process standards. And those big process standards are problem solving, reasoning and proof, communication, connection, and representation. And These process standards were really developed through a lot of research, and we've really seen throughout the years that each of these are interwoven with each other. So students' problem-solving skills increase, it helps build their reasoning skills. If their communication skills go up, it helps them see the connections between different mathematical ideas. So essentially, when students build their communication skills, they're also building their reasoning skills, their problem-solving skills, their skills at seeing those representation, their skills at connecting different mathematics. So by building their communication skills, which is whether it's reading or writing, whatever that happens to be, they're building all of their problem-solving skills. And kind of an interrelated backstory, when these standards came out, I thought, okay, I'm going to include writing prompts on my tests. And I remember in my geometry classes, every geometry test had a writing prompt on it. And I put these on and I thought, this is going to help my students build their skills. And I tell you what, it did not go over well. The students weren't writing very well. I felt it wasn't building anything. They didn't like it. I didn't like it. And what I learned from that is I can't just ask them to complete a writing prompt without giving them practice with writing before we try to test on it. So I learned the hard way that I need to include writing prompts on their homework. We need to include writing prompts in the classroom. And I myself needed to model good writing skills. So I had to actually do some of these problems myself with the class so they could see what my thought process was when I was doing that writing. And I found through this, then when they saw those writing prompts on their assessments, then I saw really high quality writing out of them. I saw them connect what they were learning to other topics. And I saw their problem solving and reasoning skills increase as well.
It's interesting you say that, Dave, because writing isn't something naturally I think teachers incorporate into their math lessons, right? It's something more, I think, oh, that's for literacy or English language arts. And so I think once students have those opportunities, they become better at it. And in the elementary level, a lot of students maybe aren't as fluent with their writing. So they may be using just words or symbols or drawings to communicate their mathematical ideas. And when they do this, they can articulate their reasoning and justify their solutions through that text. And then they have to maybe talk about it. So that really increases that communication. And when a student is writing something, they have to really think about why or how they know their answer makes sense to be able to communicate through that, which I think really increases that reasoning. And when it comes to problem solving, when students are writing down their thinking or capturing their thinking on paper, they have to really put their thoughts together in a clear and organized way, right? It can't be all over the page. They kind of have to be really systematic and think about it. It also helps them break down their complex tasks because we all know that when we're given a problem or when students are given a problem to solve, oftentimes it's daunting. It's like, oh my gosh, there's so much. I don't know where to start. But getting something written on paper gives them an entry point, and then they can start to think about deeply. It also stays as a record of what they've been thinking, and they don't have to keep all that stuff in their head because that's a lot to just keep mentally and be thinking about different parts of the problem and trying to solve that. So they're able to keep track of everything. And often when they write too, they start to catch their own misconceptions or errors when they go back and reread. And that's really another benefit too of writing in the mathematics classroom.
Thanks, Dave and Susie. You guys have done a great job talking about the importance of communication in the math classroom and how we use literacy and mathematics to work together for that. So let's think about speaking and listening skills when we think about communication. How do you encourage students to engage in mathematical discussions and incorporate precise academic language as part of your integration of literacy and mathematics?
Well, Latrenda, math talk or mathematical discourse is really an important part of learning mathematics. And we know NCTM actually states that as one of their 8 effective teaching practices. And so, what I think teachers really need to be intentional about providing opportunities that encourage students to talk. The more the students engage in conversations about mathematics, the more natural it becomes, and then it contributes to their learning. So, as I think about this, I want to share an example, and I think this will give you an insight into what this might look like in a typical lesson. I was in a second grade classroom recently, and they were really exploring that bar graphs and data. And at the beginning of the lesson, the teacher did such a wonderful job. She just put up a bar graph on the screen and just said, "What do you notice about this graph?" And then groups of students started to talk with each other and they started to notice things. And then the teacher pulled everybody back together in a large group and they were sharing things that they knew. And at one point, a student said, "Well, the word food tells us what the graph's about." And that precise language, that was an opportunity for the teacher to say, that is correct. And a bar graph, we call that a heading or a title. And so she was able to then use the students' words and knowledge, but then give that some precise mathematical language. And so they engaged in this conversation, and then the teacher said, okay, now we're going to let you work on a bar graph and you're going to work with a partner. And so they collaboratively worked together to complete that task. And what was really cool is, what word did we hear? We have to put a title or heading on our bar graph, right? So it was coming up in those conversations, just as, like I said, a natural part of the conversation. After a little bit of time, the teacher pulled the whole class back together, and then she invited 2 students to come up and talk about their bar graph and share their thinking with their peers. So that opportunity to communicate their ideas and their thinking. And then, of course, to promote listening, the teacher really has some great prompts. She's like, Johnny, what do you think about what Rose said about the number of pizzas in that graph? And so pulled that back together. So that really encouraged listening and thinking about someone else's thinking. Then a little bit later, she said, okay, now I want you to turn and talk and discuss if you agree or disagree with what you just heard about the graph. And so there were just so many examples throughout that lesson of where students were able to communicate about their ideas and talk and listen. And I just think that because that teacher was so intentional with the choices that she made for instruction, that students had that opportunity to communicate with each other and listen. And then the deeper that mathematics learning really was.
Susie, I really like that, how you're talking about intentionally encouraging student talk, because it's not an elementary math thing. We see it at the high school level as well. It's another K-12 idea. And so how do we intentionally encourage that talk? And there's a number of different strategies and different things we need to keep in mind when we do this. And I think the number one thing before we start is we need to create a safe and inclusive environment for all our students. And I'm going to say, especially at the high school level, because a lot of times high school students don't expect to be talking and discussing a lot in math class. For them to go out of their comfort zone, we have to make sure that they have a safe environment to do that. Another thing, we need to use rich and open-ended tasks. Task with a low floor, high ceiling just gives every student an entry point into that task and every student a way to grow through that task. You mentioned this, Susie, asking those open-ended questions. Your example, you said, a teacher said, what do you notice? So then we want to model our student thinking through our whole class discussions. And then an easy way to get our students to justify and explain is just always ask the question, why? If they give an answer, why? Why is that? Where did that answer come from? Can you justify where that came from, to get them talking about that? So it's not just about giving that answer, it's about where it came from, which gets into the last point I want to make here, just focusing on the process rather than the product, focusing on how we got to where we got to instead of focusing on that final answer. And one upper level math idea that I use all the time, I especially like this in pre-calculus, where we get into some really high level mathematics. I have students pair up where one student faces the board and the other student has their back to the board, but they've got a whiteboard in their hand. And student one sees a function and has to describe the elements about the graph of that function. Whatever those elements might be, an x-intercept, y-intercept, where the graph is increasing, decreasing. And then student two, based on this description, needs to sketch a graph of that function. And it really gets into students using precise language to describe what's going on in that function. Both students are practicing speaking and listening skills as they swap roles at some point during this. And it's a really engaging way to get kids talking in a safe way as well, because they're just talking to their partner. They're not talking to the whole class. So it's a great idea that, like I've said, I've used in my pre-calculus classes, but I can see using that in any K-12 math class.
I'm so enjoying this conversation, hearing practical examples of what it looks like at that secondary level as well as the elementary level. And I love how we started out talking about children's books and moved into reading, and then we shifted to writing, and now we've shifted a little bit to discourse. What advice would either one of you have for educators who are looking to strengthen that connection between math and literacy in their own classrooms? I mean, any advice you might give to somebody trying to continue to strengthen the existing work that they've done?
I'd first encourage teachers to think about their current practices, because they're probably already doing some of these things. And I think naturally we go to the what we're not doing, and we don't take time to celebrate those great things that are already happening in our classrooms. So that'd be the first thing I would ask them to do. And then I would encourage teachers to start really small. And so maybe try one new thing. And maybe that would be like, oh, I want to incorporate more turn and talks into my lessons. When I've worked with teachers and during planning, we get a sticky note, we put T&T, turn and talk. And then we might put the question that we want to ask at that point. So then the teacher's a little more intentional about, oh, when we get to this part of the lesson, I want to make sure that I incorporate this. and then just stick with that same strategy and get good at it and really practice, because then it'll just become a natural part of what they do. Another idea would be, I know some teachers want to use specific talk moves, or they want to give themselves a reminder of saying, oh, can you add on to what Kevin just said? And so that really encourages students to respond to their peers and add their thinking to that conversation. And so I know one teacher put a really small sign up in the back of the room so only she could see it. So she was standing in the front of the room where she was working with her students, but in the back room, there was a really small sign. And that sign really served as just as a quick reminder to her to use that prompt, because it wasn't something that she had in her toolbox, that just happened naturally. And so I think eventually when teachers try these things, they just become more comfortable. The students get more comfortable, and then they can move on to something different. But I think just start small would be the advice I would give.
I think, first of all, just recognizing the importance of literacy in the mathematics classroom. And, at the high school level, there's a lot of focus on standardized tests like the ACT, the SAT, or even advanced placement FRQs or free response questions. And just recognizing that if you look at these questions, they're not just testing students' mathematical skills, they're testing their mathematics literacy. These are reading questions that our students need to interpret in order to solve. And just recognizing that, hey, this is important. Our students will be seeing these kind of problems again. Like Susie was saying, starting small, and just like our students are learning and growing all the time, so are we. And when we do start small, don't expect to be perfect every time. Model trying something new, and even explain to our students why we're doing this. And the idea of metacognition, that explaining our thinking as we're going through our thinking, I think is really important for our students to see us as learners as well, for them to see us as trying something new as well. I think that's really, really important. And then one last piece of advice, I think just utilizing our colleagues and our resources. There's a list of mathical books. The mathical book list is just a fabulous list of resources for our teachers and students to use. NCTM resources, whenever I get that new journal, there's all kinds of new ideas to use in our classes. And I read those articles even on the K4 literacy, because those elementary school teachers, they know how to teach. I might know the upper level math, but those elementary level teachers, they know how to teach. And I'm going to learn every bit I can from them about teaching literacy, because those ideas extend to every K-12 class.
Dave and Susie, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your ideas, your strategies, and really just wonderful advice to our listeners about the connection between literacy and mathematics. So, how can conferences like our upcoming Joint Literacy and Math Conference, our joint venture with NCTE and NCTM, how can conferences such as that help educators strengthen the connection between math and literacy in their classrooms or in their particular settings?
Thank you, Latrenda. First of all, I think it's just a wonderful opportunity for us to tear down the silos in education. So often, as a high school math teacher, the expectation is that we work with our fellow high school math teachers, but the English teachers, the history teachers, the science teachers, they're doing their own thing. And even people beyond high school, the middle school teachers, elementary, they're doing their own thing. So great opportunity to tear down those silos and work together with all of our colleagues to help our students learn. And I firmly believe good teaching and learning transcends subject matter. So if there's a strategy that works well in a fourth grade literacy class, it's probably something that I can make work well in my high school class as well. It was really interesting. So I went and looked at the conference strands, and this one strand really piqued my interest. So one of the strands for the upcoming NCTM-NCT Joint Conference is using literacy practices in mathematics and using mathematics practices in literacy. And the bullets following that strand are to use writing in math class to bolster understanding of concepts. Second bullet, make use of comprehension skills to help students understand math word problems. Third bullet, apply reasoning skills from math to help students comprehend literature. And fourth, creative ways to use children's literature to strengthen math and literacy instruction. And I don't know about you, but I read this strand and I think this is what teaching literacy and math is all about. In fact, this is what teaching math is all about. And I'm excited to see these sessions that come together around this strand at the conference this summer.
So, conferences really provide opportunities for teachers to come together from across the country to share their thoughts and their ideas and their celebrations about the integration of math and literacy in their own practice. And I think the joint conference was going to absolutely do that for those practitioners. And personally, I just love connecting with other teachers who share that same passion that I do is about teaching and learning. I can always learn something from the conversations, whether it's through something during a session or it's just a casual conversation before or after a session. I just think that those are ways that we can learn from each other or make those connections. And I personally know that this joint conference, where there's going to be hundreds of sessions that participants can choose from to attend, and I'm really confident that everybody that attends is going to walk away from each session either thinking about their instruction a little bit differently and or have new ideas to incorporate into their teaching in terms of math and literacy and that connection. So I hope everybody that comes to the joint conference feels the same way and goes back to their respective contexts, really thinking about how they can tighten the connection between math and literacy and be reinvigorated about teaching, because I think that's exactly what attending a conference does. So I'm really looking forward to June and meeting everyone who can come.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward to that conference. And Dave, if you want to, even though it's elementary, come on by and join us and join in the fun.
Oh, I'd love to join you.
You're welcome to come.
Yeah, we'd love to have you, Dave.
Thanks again to Susie and Dave for joining us today to share thoughtful, insightful, and practical strategies and ideas to help our listeners strengthen the connection between math and literacy for this edition of Adding It All Up. Listeners, be sure to tune in again next month for our next episode, and we look forward to seeing you again on Adding It All Up. Thanks for listening.
This episode is sponsored by Prodigy Math. Looking for a way to boost math motivation in your classroom? Try Prodigy. It's a free, award-winning, game-based platform for grades 1 through 8 that turns learning into an adventure for students and teachers. Learn more at prodigy.com. Thank you for listening to this episode of Adding It All Up. At NCTM, we strive to bring you the biggest topics happening in mathematics. Join us next month for another exciting discussion.